The Ashworth inventory had not been completed in 14 years, and Prudence Hollis was the only person in the house who seemed to find that remarkable. She stood in the linen corridor on the third floor of Ashworth Park, a tallow candle in one hand and a ledger open across her forearm, and she counted 12 damask tablecloths bearing the ducal crest, 7 without, 3 that bore a crest she did not recognize at all, which was its own small problem she would note and return to. The corridor was cold in the way that old houses are cold even in June, not from lack of fire, but from the accumulated chill of stone that has been standing longer than anyone alive can remember. Prudence did not mind cold. She had learned to work in worse. Below her, on the ground floor and the first, Ashworth Park was conducting itself with full ceremonial excess. The Duke of Ashworth had arrived from London that afternoon, and the household had dressed itself accordingly, the great hall's candelabras lit, the silver polished to a severity that bordered on aggression, the cut flowers from the kitchen garden arranged in the blue porcelain urns that only came down from the cabinet for titled guests. Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, had managed all of it with the controlled urgency of a woman who knows that her position rests on invisible logistics. The footmen wore their best livery. The maids had been told not to be seen. The cook had begun the veal the previous evening. Prudence had been told to count the linen. She did not, on the whole, object to this. Counting linen was at least honest work, and there was information in linen about how a household was actually managed, about what had been allowed to deteriorate, about who paid attention and who did not. She had learned that long ago. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She moved her candle to the left and examined the next shelf. Napkins, folded in thirds. She counted in a low murmur, her pencil marking tallies in the margin of the ledger. 22, 23, and then the sound of footsteps on the corridor stairs. Not Mrs. Fenn's careful tread, but something heavier and more deliberate, the kind of step that does not expect to encounter anyone. Prudence did not turn around immediately. She finished the count. 26 napkins, which was 4 fewer than the household's own record indicated. She noted the discrepancy, made a bracket in the margin, and then turned, holding her candle at shoulder height so as not to blind either of them. The Duke of Ashworth was standing at the entrance to the linen corridor in his traveling coat, which he had not yet changed, which meant he had come up here directly from arrival. He was tall and dark-haired and precisely dressed beneath the coat, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized at some effort, not surprise, not dismissal, but the calibrating attention of someone working out exactly what they are looking at. She straightened her spine. "Your Grace," she said, "I apologize. I was told the third floor was not required for this evening." He looked at the ledger across her arm. He looked at the shelves. He looked back at her. "You are counting," he said. "Yes," she said. "The linen inventory." "It has not been done since my father's time," he said. It was not a question. "So I understand," she said. "There are some notable gaps. I have listed them." He did not say anything to that. He simply looked at her, at the pencil still in her hand, at the 3 unidentified tablecloths she had set aside on the lower shelf. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor stairs, without another word, and Prudence stood very still for a moment, before returning to her count. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. 27 napkins, 28, she pressed on. Prudence Hollis had arrived at Ashworth Park 6 weeks earlier with a letter of introduction from Mr. Aldous Keene, a retired solicitor in Shrewsbury, who had known her father. The letter described her as a woman of competent disposition suitable for temporary household administration during the estate's transitional period, which was the most dignified possible description of what the situation at Ashworth actually required. The estate had been under the management of the Duke's cousin, Mr. Gerald Vane, for 3 years, during the Duke's extended absence in London, and Mr. Vane had done something that estate managers rarely do with any efficiency. He had managed to be both incompetent and dishonest at the same time, achieving a result that was somehow worse than either would have been separately. She had understood none of this when she arrived. She had been told only that the estate required temporary administrative help, that the previous assistant had left under unclear circumstances, and that the position would last approximately 2 months. She had accepted because she needed the income, and because Mr. Keene had recommended her, and because 2 months of honest work at Ashworth was preferable to the alternative, which was returning to her aunt's house in Telford. She had been at her aunt's house for 2 years before this. She did not count those years against anything in particular. She had chosen to go, in the end, because her cousin Margaret needed someone to help with the children, and the alternative for Prudence after her father's death had been a position in service elsewhere, which amounted to the same labor with none of the family connection. So she had gone to Telford, and she had managed her aunt's household with the same methodical thoroughness she had brought to everything since she was 17, and she had been thanked for it in the way that useful people are usually thanked, with continued requests for usefulness, with the assumption that she would manage, with the understanding that she required nothing special in return. Her father had been a solicitor himself, not as established as Mr. Keene, but competent and deeply honest, and when he died, of a fever in the winter of her 21st year, he had left behind approximately £200, a good reputation among his clients, and a daughter with a thorough understanding of account-keeping, legal correspondence, and the correct execution of contracts. These were not the skills that anyone in Shropshire had known what to do with in a young woman of no income and no particular connection. She had been told, more than once, that she was fortunate her aunt had room. She had not considered herself fortunate. She had considered herself positioned, as a carpenter's tool is positioned on the wrong shelf, waiting for someone to reach for the right thing. It was at her aunt's house that she had, inadvertently, saved the family from a financial catastrophe they did not realize was approaching. Her uncle had entered into a wool purchasing agreement with a merchant from Ludlow whose contract contained a clause, buried in the third attachment, written in the kind of language that requires reading twice to understand once, that entitled the merchant to renegotiate prices quarterly at his sole discretion while holding her uncle's advance payment in full. It was, as these things go, not precisely fraud. It was simply the leverage of someone who assumed the other party would not read carefully enough. Prudence had read carefully enough. She had brought the clause to her uncle on a Tuesday morning and explained it in plain language, then drafted an amendment and sent it to Mr. Keene for review. And the merchant had accepted the amendment because the only alternative was exposure of a tactic he used regularly and preferred to keep quiet. Her uncle had thanked her by telling her aunt that Prudence had good sense. Her aunt had told the neighbors that Prudence had useful book learning. The incident was not otherwise remarked upon. She had managed her aunt's accounts for 2 years. She had prevented 3 creditor disputes, renegotiated the lease on the barn in the North Field, and supervised the household through 2 winters and 1 episode of influenza that took out 4 of the servants simultaneously. She had done all of this quietly and completely, with no ceremony, returning each morning to whatever had been left unfinished, and finishing it. The moment she had almost broken, not from the labor, but from something quieter and harder to name, had come in the second winter, on a December afternoon when her cousin Margaret had been ill, and Prudence had managed the household alone for a week, and at the end of it had sat down in the kitchen after the children were asleep, and felt the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body. She had sat there for a long time. She had let herself feel it, and then she had picked up her list and gone on, because she was not going to become less than she was, simply because no one was looking. She was not going to step aside for anyone. It was Mr. Keene, visiting her aunt's house in April, who had told her about Ashworth. He was a small, precise man, who had a habit of looking at people as though taking inventory, and he had looked at Prudence across the tea table with that particular expression and said, "There is a situation at the Duke of Ashworth's estate in Shropshire that requires someone with a specific set of skills. The Duke is returning from London in June. The estate is in some disarray. You would be paid £45 for 2 months, with accommodation and meals. I believe you would find it interesting." She had thought about it for exactly as long as it took to pour the next cup. "When would I begin?" she had asked. She had arrived to find the estate in considerably more disarray than she had been led to expect. Rhys Ashworth, the 8th Duke of Ashworth, had been in London for 3 years, not from preference, though London had its uses, but from necessity. He had a wound he did not discuss in social company, and would not have described as a wound at all, but it was there, in the particular stillness with which he moved through any room that contained the things his mother had loved. She had died at Ashworth, in the winter of his 28th year, of a prolonged illness that the physicians had managed with impressive confidence and no particular effect. She had been the person who understood the estate as a living thing rather than an asset, and she had been, in the way of people who are very good at making things run, nearly invisible in her competence until she was gone. He had left for London 6 months after her death, telling himself it was for the legal and investment matters that required his personal presence. He had hired Gerald Vane to manage the estate in his absence, because Vane was family and appeared reliable and had said the right things. He had paid minimal attention to the quarterly reports, which had been pleasant and regular and, he now understood, almost entirely fictional. The investigator's report had arrived in April. It was 31 pages, assembled with the dry precision of a man who had been paid well and wished to demonstrate it, and it detailed Gerald Vane's management of Ashworth over 3 years with the comprehensiveness of a case for the courts, which was in fact what it might become. The core of it was this: Vane had entered into 11 separate agreements on the estate's behalf, with wool merchants, with timber contractors, with 2 farming concerns in the neighboring county, without the Duke's knowledge or authority. 8 of those agreements were disadvantageous. 3 were actively fraudulent. The total exposure to the Ashworth estate was somewhere between £4,000 and £7,000, depending on how the courts read the provisions, and the investors in question were not the kind of men who waited patiently. Rees had read the report twice. He had put it down. He had picked it up and read the section on the 3 fraudulent agreements a 3rd time. Then he had written to Mr. Keene, who was his family's solicitor in Shrewsbury, and who was, of his acquaintance, the person most likely to know where a specific kind of help could be found. He had said, in the letter, that he needed someone who could read the agreements that had been made in his name, organize the evidence of what Vane had done, and assist in preparing the estate's legal defense before he arrived in June. He had added, as a second thought, in the postscript, that the person should be accustomed to working without fanfare, as the situation was delicate, and he did not want Ashworth Park turning into a theater. Keene had written back with the name of Prudence Hollis. He had not expected, when he read the name, to feel anything in particular about it, but the letter that accompanied the name, a brief note Keene had enclosed, written in a plain, structured hand, without any of the softening qualifications that often appeared when someone was recommended out of charity, had given him pause. It described Prudence Hollis as a woman who did not require supervision, who had twice identified contractual vulnerabilities that trained solicitors had missed, and who had, in Keene's precise phrasing, the particular quality of being useful rather than merely willing. He had filed this away. He was good at filing things away until he needed them. He had hired a man to gather further information, as he did with anyone he was about to install in his household, and the additional information had been plain and consistent. 5 years of household management at varying scales, no scandal, no complaint. A reputation among tradesmen in Telford for paying accounts promptly and reading invoices before signing them. One additional detail that had come from a wool merchant who happened to know her uncle. She had identified a contract manipulation that his own legal counsel had missed, and had corrected it without making it a public event. He had arrived at Ashworth Park prepared, in the methodical way that he prepared for everything, to find a capable woman he would direct toward a specific problem and then pay accordingly. He had not expected to find her on the 3rd floor of the linen corridor, at 9 in the evening, with a candle and a ledger, moving through the inventory, with the quiet focus of someone who has been at this particular task since before supper and intends to finish it before she stops. He had gone up to the 3rd floor. He was not entirely sure why he had gone directly to the 3rd floor upon arrival, except that he had not been there in 3 years, and there was something he had needed to confirm was still where it should be. And he had found her instead, and she had turned around and looked at him without flinching, and he had understood at once that she had been here 6 weeks, and had done more work in 6 weeks than Vane had done in 3 years. He stood in the corridor for a moment after descending, his hand on the banister. He had stood in corridors before. He had stood outside the music room on this same floor, 3 nights running before he left for London the last time, listening to his mother play through the closed door, because he had not been ready to go in. He understood something about standing in corridors. He had her brought the full set of agreements the following morning, with a note asking her to annotate anything that struck her as irregular. He had expected this to take the better part of the week. She had returned the annotated copies within 2 days. Ashworth Park assembled its antagonisms quietly and with great efficiency. Lady Cecily Wyndham Rowe arrived on the 4th day of the Duke's return, with her mother and a lady's maid, and a quantity of luggage that suggested a stay of several weeks. She was beautiful in the organized way of women who have always known they would be beautiful, and she moved through the house with the comfortable propriety of someone who has been quietly told that it will, in time, be hers. Her mother and the Duchess Dowager, the Duke's aunt, Lady Meredith, who lived in the East Wing and had strong opinions about almost everything, had been corresponding about the matter for 2 years, and Cecily had been prepared accordingly. She wore her blue gown to dinner on the first night, which was the right gown, and she spoke to the Duke with the pleasant attention of someone who has done considerable preparation and is now enacting it. She noticed Prudence on the 2nd day, which was 1 day later than Prudence had noticed her. "You are the administrator Mrs. Fenn mentioned," Cecily said, encountering her in the morning room where Prudence had spread 3 of the Vane agreements across the writing table. "Yes," Prudence said. "Prudence Hollis. I apologize for the occupation of the room. I can move to the estate office if the morning room is needed." Cecily looked at the papers. She had been well educated and was not incurious, but the documents on the table appeared to be columns of figures and attached legal clauses, and she did not ask about them. "Mrs. Fenn said you were brought in to help sort out some household difficulty," she said. "Something of that kind," Prudence said. "How long do you expect to be here?" "That depends on what is found," Prudence said, which was true, and also, she recognized, slightly less than the whole answer. Cecily left the room, and Prudence returned to the 3rd attachment of the Ludlow timber agreement, where Vane had written his own name as signatory, without including the standard limiting clause that would have required the Duke's countersignature for any amount above £500. It was the same mechanism she had seen in her uncle's wool contract, and it had the same quality of not being precisely fraud until it was. She made a note in the margin. She had been making notes for 2 days, and the margin of the timber agreement was now dense with them. The Duke came to the morning room at 11. He read her annotations without speaking for several minutes, standing at the writing table rather than sitting, which she had noted was his habit. He reached the note on the 3rd attachment and was still for a moment. "He used his name as sole signatory," he said. "Yes," she said, "for amounts that required your countersignature under the terms of his management agreement. I have found the original management agreement in the estate files. It specifies £200 as the threshold, not 500. He has been operating at his own revised threshold. He changed the threshold. He omitted to change it on record. The original document is intact. I have compared the signature dates." She opened the ledger to the relevant page and set it beside the timber agreement. The Duke looked at both. "The original management agreement predates the timber contract by 14 months, he said. "Yes, and the signature on the threshold notation in the timber agreement appears to have been added after the body of the document was drafted. The ink depth is inconsistent across that line, and the notation itself is in a slightly different register than the surrounding text." She said this plainly, as a fact she had established by looking carefully, and watched him read the line again. "You observed that from inspection," he said. "It was not quite a question. My father was a solicitor," she said. "He taught me to read documents as documents, not as representations of what someone says they contain." He looked at her then, not the measuring attention of that first evening, but something quieter and more settled, the expression of someone who has verified something they had already suspected. He straightened, set the timber agreement precisely parallel to the ledger, and said, "How many of the 11 agreements have this kind of discrepancy?" "So far 7. I have 4 remaining. You have been here 2 days. I worked through yesterday evening," she said. "The lamp oil in the estate office is adequate." He was silent for a moment. Then, "I will have a better lamp sent to the estate office." It was not, as these things go, an extraordinary gesture, but he did it that afternoon, and when she came back to the estate office after supper, there was a proper brass reading lamp on the table, already filled, with 2 extra reservoirs of oil beside it. She stood for a moment looking at it. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table, and then she sat down and began the 8th agreement. Lady Meredith, the Duke's aunt, presented herself to Prudence on the 5th day of the Duke's return. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, who had lived at Ashworth Park for 12 years, and had, during that time, accumulated opinions about the estate's management, its social position, and the appropriate conduct of its household that she maintained with the confidence of someone who has never been seriously contradicted. She found Prudence in the estate garden, where Prudence had gone briefly after lunch because she had been indoors for 4 days, and her head required air. She was sitting on the low stone wall that bordered the kitchen garden, eating an apple, and looking at the kitchen garden's neglect, the beds unweeded, the cold frames broken, the productive potential of the thing quite visible beneath its disorder, with the expression of someone making preliminary notes. "Miss Hollis," Lady Meredith said, "I was told you would be in the estate office." "I am taking 20 minutes in the garden," Prudence said. "I will return at 1:30. Lady Meredith settled her shawl. "I wish to speak with you about your work here. My nephew has told me you are examining the management agreements." "Yes. I want you to understand," Lady Meredith said, in the tone of someone conveying important structural information, "that the situation with Mr. Vane, however it resolves, is a matter for the Duke and his legal counsel. It is not a matter to be managed by a temporary appointment. When matters have proceeded to the appropriate stage, the Duke's solicitors will take the necessary steps." Prudence finished the apple. She set the core down on the wall beside her. "I understand," she said. "The Duke's solicitors are Mr. Keene and his associates in Shrewsbury. They will require organized documentation of the discrepancies before they can build a coherent case. At present, the agreements are in 11 separate files, several of which are incomplete, and at least 2 of which have pages filed in the wrong order. I am organizing the documentation." "That is precisely what I was hired to do." Lady Meredith looked at her with an expression that was not quite displeasure. "You are direct," she said. "I have found it saves time," Prudence said. She returned to the estate office at 1:30, as she had said she would. She was aware that Lady Meredith stood for a moment by the garden wall before going inside. The kitchen maid, whose name was Nora, and who brought the estate office its morning tea, had taken to setting an extra biscuit on the tray after the 3rd day, without comment. Prudence noted this with quiet gratitude and did not mention it. She had learned that gratitude for small kindnesses is best expressed by receiving them without elaborating on them. She met Margaret Fenn, the housekeeper who had turned out to be, beneath the professional formality, a woman of sharp intelligence and considerable institutional knowledge, in the linen corridor on the day she finished the linen count. Mrs. Fenn had appeared at the top of the stairs with the expression of someone who has been told a thing and does not quite believe it. "You found 17 discrepancies," Mrs. Fenn said. 18, Prudence said. "One I found this morning. The Holland cloth in the 3rd cupboard. There are 12 yards entered in the 1819 inventory, and 3 yards actually present. The difference is large enough to indicate either significant unrecorded use or removal from the house." "He sold it," Mrs. Fenn said. There was a short silence. "Mr. Vane, he sold several items. I could not prove it, and I had no authority to report it to the Duke directly, and the solicitors—" She stopped. "You did not know how to bring it forward," Prudence said. "It would have been my word against his," Mrs. Fenn said. "He was family. I am a housekeeper." Prudence looked at her. "I have a ledger," she said, "and I have the 1819 inventory. If you can tell me what you observed and when, we can document it." Mrs. Fenn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I kept my own notes. I did not dare do anything more than that, but I kept notes." "Show me," Prudence said. They spent 2 hours in Mrs. Fenn's small sitting room that afternoon, going through 4 years of careful domestic records that Mrs. Fenn had kept in a green notebook she had never shown anyone. It was meticulous work: dates, items, estimated values, notations of what Vane had told the household staff to record, and what she had separately observed. It was not legal evidence, but it was consistent, specific, and organized, and combined with the account discrepancies Prudence had already found in the estate files, it built a picture that required no elaboration. "This is good work," Prudence said, looking at the notebook. "4 years of this. I thought perhaps one day it would matter," Mrs. Fenn said. "It will," Prudence said. It was during the second week that Reese came to the estate office in the evening. She had not expected him. She had believed him occupied with the dinner Lady Meredith had arranged, which had included the Wyndham Rose and 2 other neighboring families, and which had required the drawing room to be prepared in a specific manner that Prudence had assisted with briefly before returning to her work. He came in at 9:30 and sat down in the chair across from her, which no one had yet done. He sat without ceremony, in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat, the tailcoat removed, and looked at the papers she had organized in 3 columns across the writing table. "You are not at dinner," she said. "It concluded," he said. "How many agreements have you completed?" "All 11. She turned the ledger to face him. "I have a summary." He read it. He read it with the full attention he gave to everything, which was not performative but was complete, and she watched the particular stillness that came over him when he reached the final column. 9 of the 11 agreements contained actionable discrepancies. The total documented exposure to the estate was £4,800, of which approximately £2,000 could be directly attributed to Vane's unauthorized signatory use, for which the legal exposure was clear. "Keene will need to see this before I can take the next step," he said. "I anticipated that. The summary is written for a legal audience. The attachments are filed in the order that corresponds to the claims, not the dates." She indicated the folders at the right side of the table. "If Mr. Keene comes to Ashworth, he can review everything in one session. If the documents are sent to him, they are organized to travel in order." He looked at the folders. He looked at the lamp, the brass lamp he had sent 3 weeks ago, still burning steadily with one of the replacement reservoirs she had used through to its last half-inch. "You worked through to the final oil supply," he said. "I sent a note to the housekeeper for more," she said. "She was very accommodating." There was a pause. It was not uncomfortable. It was the particular quiet that accumulates between 2 people who have been working toward the same thing from different angles and have just found that the angles meet. "Your cravat has been crooked since before dinner," she said. He looked at her. "I noticed it when you came in," she said. "It has been the left side, 40 minutes at least." He reached up and touched the cravat, which was, in fact, pulled slightly to the left. He adjusted it. She watched him adjust it with the slightly imprecise confidence of a man who dresses with a valet's help and is not entirely certain of the mechanics without one, and she thought about saying something and then did not. "Miss Hollis," he said, "when we go before the investors, and we will have to, Keene has told me the Ludlow Consortium wishes to meet formally before any legal action is taken. I would like you to present what you have found." She was still for a moment. "I am not a solicitor," she said. "No," he said, "but Keene is, and he will be there. What you have found requires someone who understood what they were looking at when they found it. Keene can corroborate the legal dimensions. You are the one who read the documents." She thought about it completely, the habit she had always had, going back to her father's study, of not answering until she had thought a thing through to its end. "Very well," she said. "I will need to prepare a presentation of the evidence in a form the investors can follow. That will require additional time." "How much time?" "1 week," she said. "Possibly less." He was quiet for a moment. "You will have it," he said. He stood. He was at the door before she spoke again. "Your Grace," she said, "the estate office window faces west. In the mornings, the light is inadequate before 9. If the morning room could be made available to me between 7 and 9, I can work better in those hours." He turned back. "Done," he said. She watched him leave. She pressed one hand against the writing table's edge, briefly, and then she turned back to the ledger and began the formal presentation. She had managed 14 years of invisible labor in various forms. She could manage this. 11 days before the formal investor meeting, Lady Cecily Wyndham Rowe spoke to Prudence in the corridor outside the drawing room, in the specific way of a woman who has waited for a private moment and selected the location carefully. I want to understand, Cecily said. Her tone was even, which was something Prudence gave her credit for. What is your position here? I am a temporary administrative appointment, Prudence said, hired to examine the estate management agreements and prepare documentation for the Duke's solicitors. You have been here 7 weeks, Cecily said. The Duke takes dinner in the estate office with you 3 evenings a week. He reads the progress of the documentation. I am there when he reads it because I can answer questions as they arise. You are a woman of no connection, eating dinner with a duke, Cecily said. Prudence looked at her. She did not feel anger. She felt the particular clarity that came with a direct statement of fact, even when the fact was offered as an injury. That is true, she said. I am a woman of no connection, and I have found £4,800 in documented fraud committed against this estate over 3 years, which is currently the most pressing concern at Ashworth Park, and will remain so until the investors are satisfied and the legal question of Mr. Vane's liability is resolved. After that, I expect my appointment will conclude, and I will not require the Duke's dinner table. Cecily looked at her for a long moment. She was not cruel, Prudence thought. She was simply a woman who had been told what she was entitled to, and had organized her understanding of the world accordingly. I did not mean to imply, Cecily began. You implied nothing that is not structurally accurate, Prudence said. You are quite right about my position. I hope the meeting with the investors resolves smoothly. She inclined her head and went toward the morning room, where the second presentation draft was waiting. She sat down at the writing table and arranged the pages. She had 17 minutes before she needed the morning room vacated, and she intended to use them. He found her in the music room on the Friday evening before the meeting. She had not gone there deliberately. She had been looking for a particular copy of the estate's rental agreement from 1811, which she had tracked to a box of older papers that had been stored in the music room's lower cabinet, and she had found the rental agreement, and also, while looking, a piece of sheet music folded into the back of the cabinet with the particular care of something that had been placed rather than stored. She did not open it, but she set it on top of the cabinet because it had been at the bottom of the box and she did not wish to damage it. She was straightening the papers from the box when he came in. He stopped at the door. He looked at the sheet music on the cabinet with the expression she had come to associate with specific effort, the controlled stillness that meant something was costing him something. I apologize, she said. I was looking for the 1811 rental terms. I found the music. I did not open it. I simply moved it to protect it. He crossed the room and picked up the music. He stood with it for a moment, looking at it, and she busied herself with refiling the papers from the box. She used to play in this room, he said. He did not say who. Yes, Prudence said quietly. She continued filing. She played every evening for an hour, he said. After dinner, we could hear it through the house. A pause. I have not been in this room since before London. Prudence closed the cabinet drawer. She stood up. The room is in good repair, she said. The piano has not been tuned, but the case is sound. She said it simply, as something true that did not require elaboration, and she watched him set the sheet music carefully back on the cabinet. My mother composed that piece herself, he said. When I was 12, she played it at Christmas. He said this as a man states a fact he has carried alone for a long time and does not quite know what to do with, now that it is said. Prudence said nothing for a moment. Then, she sounds like someone who was very present. She was, he said, invisible, in the way that the person holding everything together is always invisible until they are gone. He said it without apparent awareness that he had said something Prudence recognized entirely, and she stood very still for a moment, and then she picked up the 1811 rental document she had come to find and said, I have what I needed for the presentation. Thank you for allowing the room. She moved toward the door. Miss Hollis, he said. She turned. He looked at her with the particular steadiness she had come to understand as his equivalent of a great deal of feeling held in a careful container. The presentation will be sufficient, he said. What you have assembled, it is more thorough than what Keene expected. He told me so yesterday. Mr. Keene is very kind, she said. He is precise, Reese said, which means it is a genuine assessment. She looked at him for a moment, long enough to understand that he meant it, and that meaning it had cost him something small and real. "Then I will try to be worthy of a precise assessment," she said, and she left the music room and went back to the estate office, and she sat for a full minute doing nothing before she opened the rental document. She had been seen, in this house, she thought, by a brass lamp sent down without ceremony, by a better window for morning work, by a man who stood in music rooms that cost him something and found, through a closed cabinet, the grief he had not resolved. She picked up her pen and went back to the presentation. The investors arrived at Ashworth Park on a Thursday, in the third week of July. There were 6 of them, 3 members of the Ludlow Timber Consortium, 1 representative of the Wool Merchant Cooperative, and 2 investors from the Manchester Manufacturing Interest, who had entered into an agreement with Vane the previous spring, and had, in the past month, begun to suspect they had been misled. Gerald Vane himself arrived separately, with a solicitor of his own from Birmingham, and settled in the drawing room with the tight composure of a man who has decided that confidence is the most functional available strategy. The meeting was held in the estate's formal library, which was large enough to accommodate the full party, and had, additionally, the advantage of a long center table at which documents could be spread and examined. Mr. Aldous Keene had arrived the previous day, and spent the morning reviewing Prudence's organized files with the careful attention of a man who knows he will need to answer questions about them. He had found her in the morning room at 7, and sat across from her, and gone through the files folder by folder, asking questions that were precise, and sometimes sharp, and she had answered them all. At the end, he had set the last folder down and said, "This is organized better than my own files at the office." He said it with the dry acknowledgement of a man who is not easily impressed and has not been impressing himself. "I had good materials to work with," she said. Mrs. Fenn kept her own contemporaneous records. Combined with the estate files, the timeline is complete. "The ink analysis on the threshold notation," he said. "Can that be testified to?" "It can be demonstrated visually," she said. "I have a magnifying glass and the original documents. If an investor wishes to examine the difference in ink depth, they can do so." He nodded once. "We will let them request it." The library was arranged by 10 o'clock. Prudence sat at the far left of the table, where she had a clear view of all 6 investors, of Keene, and of Vane, and where the organized files were within reach. Reese sat at the head of the table. He had not spoken to her privately that morning, but when he entered the library and moved to his position, he had glanced at the table's arrangement, the folders in order, the summary sheet placed face down at each seat, and he had given a single quiet nod. She understood the language of that. She had learned it over 7 weeks. Keene opened the meeting with a brief statement of purpose. The documents on the estate's behalf would be presented in organized form, the investors would have opportunity to examine originals, and the question of Vane's authority to enter into the agreements on the Duke's behalf would be addressed directly by reference to the original management agreement. Vane's solicitor objected to this framing almost immediately. The management agreement, he argued, had been expanded verbally by arrangement with the Duke. Keene said, without heat, that verbal arrangements were not the matter before the room. The matter before the room was what the documents said. Prudence turned to the first folder. She had prepared a presentation summary, 3 pages, clear columns, no embellishment, and she placed a copy before each investor as she began. She named each of the 11 agreements in turn, identified who had signed them, identified the authorization threshold in the original management agreement, and placed each signature date beside the threshold provision in order. It was not argument. It was a demonstration of sequence. When she reached the timber agreement, she set the original document in the center of the table and opened it to the 3rd attachment. She placed the magnifying glass beside it. "The threshold notation on this line," she said, "is written in a different register than the surrounding text and shows inconsistent ink depth. The original management agreement, filed 14 months earlier, specifies £200 as the authorization limit. The notation on this attachment reads £500. The notation appears to have been added after the body of the document was drafted. She did not say who added it. She did not need to." One of the Ludlow investors leaned forward and picked up the magnifying glass. He looked at the line for a long moment. He set the glass down. That notation, he said, was presented to my consortium as part of the original agreement. The original agreement is in this folder, Prudence said. The filing date is attested by the estate records. The comparison is available. There was a long silence of the kind that follows when something has just been made visible that cannot be made invisible again. Vane's solicitor said something to his client in a low voice. Vane had gone very still in his chair, the composure of strategy having apparently reached its limit. Prudence moved to the wool merchant agreements, then the farming contracts. She set each original document in the center of the table in its turn, and she placed beside each one the corresponding page from Keene's legal notes and the relevant entry from Mrs. Fenn's green notebook. The green notebook had been transcribed. Mrs. Fenn had not been asked to present it herself, but the transcription was accurate and dated, and its specificity was not the specificity of fabrication. By the time she reached the 11th agreement, the room had changed. Not in the way of theater. There was no eruption, no dramatic collapse. The change was quieter and more structural than that, like a load-bearing beam being confirmed sound, or the opposite of that. The investors were looking at documents, not at Vane. The Ludlow representative had stopped looking at Vane entirely. The Manchester investor, a compact, careful man who had said very little through the presentation, set down the final summary page and looked at Prudence across the table. "Miss Hollis," he said, "you compiled this in 7 weeks." 6.5, she said. "I arrived at Ashworth the last day of May." "Where were you before this?" "In Shropshire," she said. "Household administration." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "Your Grace," he said to Rees, "where did you find her?" There was a pause. Rees looked at the investor, and then he looked at Prudence, and he said, "She was recommended to me by my solicitor. I believe the question is, what we do next." He stood. The room, which had been fixed on the evidence, turned to him. "The agreements entered into by Mr. Vane without my authority are not binding on this estate," he said. "The legal basis for that position is documented here. I am prepared to negotiate fair resolution with each party who entered those agreements in good faith, on the basis of what Miss Hollis has established about which agreements are actionable and which carry legitimate claim. Mr. Vane's liability is a separate matter, and I will address it separately." He paused. "I want to be clear about one thing. The work that made this resolution possible was done by this woman, at this table, in 6.5 weeks. The estate's position is defensible because she read 11 agreements carefully and organized what she found. That is not household administration. I do not intend to describe it as such." The room was quiet. Vane's solicitor began a sentence and stopped. Vane looked at the table. The Ludlow representative looked at the Manchester investor. The Manchester investor looked at Prudence with a flat, assessing expression that she recognized as genuine attention. Keene, who had been watching from the end of the table, permitted himself the very small smile of a man who has recommended someone correctly and is gratified to have been right. Rees crossed to Prudence's side of the table. He took her hand, her bare right hand, which was holding nothing, and he brought it to his lips, there in front of the investors and the solicitors and Gerald Vane, who was by now staring at the tabletop, and held it there for a moment that the room understood before it could articulate. She looked at him. She had not expected it. She was not, precisely, surprised. She had been watching him for 7 weeks, and she understood by now that when he decided something, he held it. But she had not known he had decided this, or this fully. She did not look away. The room had changed. It would not change back. The next morning was clear and bright, one of those July mornings that comes with the particular quality of light that makes Shropshire look like it has been freshly arranged. Prudence walked in the kitchen garden after breakfast, because the formal meeting had concluded and the investors had departed, and there was, for the first morning in 6 weeks, nothing immediately requiring her. She was examining the cold frames, the broken ones she had noted on her first week in the garden, when she heard someone behind her. She turned, expecting Nora or Mrs. Fenn. It was Lord Ashworth's father, or rather, she had this slightly wrong in her mental geography. It was the Duke's uncle, Lord Arthur Wyndham, who was Lady Meredith's elder brother, and had been at the meeting yesterday as a witness to the family interest, and who had not spoken to her directly at any point. He was a man in his late 60s, gray-haired, with the upright carriage of someone who had served in an earlier military capacity, and had not quite given up the habit. He stopped a yard from her. "Miss Hollis," he said. "Lord Wyndham," she said. He looked at the cold frames she had been examining, and then he looked at her, and he said, without preamble, in the manner of someone who has thought this through and is not going to soften it, "I did not believe a woman in your position had any business in yesterday's proceedings. I said as much to my nephew 3 weeks ago." "I am aware of that," Prudence said. She had not been told directly, but she had read enough of rooms by now to know. "I was wrong," he said. "Not about the general principle. I still consider it irregular. But in the particular case, with what was at stake, you were precisely what was needed." He said this without warmth but without contempt. The assessment of a man who values accuracy more than consistency. What you organized, and how you presented it. I have seen trained solicitors present cases with less clarity. "I had good materials," she said, which was what she had said to Keene. "You had the same materials as Keene," Lord Wyndham said, "and you organized them first." He paused. "I do not say this to be gracious. I say it because it is accurate." She nodded. "I understand," she said. "Thank you." He turned and went back toward the house. She stood in the kitchen garden for a moment, and then she returned to examining the cold frames, because they were genuinely broken and would need to be replaced before autumn planting. He came to find her in the garden at 10:30. She had known he would come, in the way she had learned to know things about him, not from anything dramatic but from the accumulation of small evidences, the way a competent reader of documents comes to know what a text means by what it consistently does rather than what it announces. He walked to where she was standing by the broken cold frames, and he said, "I need to speak with you." "Yes," she said. "Not here," he said. "Will you walk?" They walked to the far edge of the kitchen garden, where a low stone wall backed against the parkland, and a stand of old oaks made a kind of shade. She was aware of the distance from the house, and of the quietness of the morning, and of the fact that she had not changed from her working dress, which was the same dress she had worn to yesterday's meeting, because she did not have another that was more suitable, and she had refused to pretend otherwise. He stopped at the wall. "I intend to ask you something," he said. "I want to ask it honestly, which means I need to tell you several things first." She waited. "The meeting yesterday resolved as it did, because of your work," he said. "The estate's legal position is defensible in large part because you spent 6 weeks reading documents that no one else had read carefully. I know that. I want you to know that I know it, and that it is not incidental to what I am about to say." She was still. "I am also aware," he said, "that I am a duke, and you are a solicitor's daughter from Shropshire, with a temporary appointment, and that proposing to you is structurally irregular by every standard my aunt, and my family, and Lady Cecily's mother would apply." He said this with the directness of someone who has already resolved the question, and is simply informing her of his resolution process. "I am not proposing to you because the estate requires a capable manager. I am not proposing because the situation requires a creditable outcome, or because any social convention suggests it." He looked at her. "I am proposing because you straightened my cravat after 40 minutes, and did not think it required comment, because you found my mother's notebook, Mrs. Fenn's notebook, which you recognized as evidence, the way you recognize everything, as something that matters, and should be properly attended to, because you have been doing extraordinary work with complete competence and no ceremony for 6 weeks in my house, and it is precisely what she used to do, and I have been looking at it for 7 weeks, and I am not going to pretend I haven't." There was a silence. It was not uncomfortable. "You are proposing to me," she said. "To be clear." "Yes," he said. She thought about it in the way she thought about everything, going to the end of the question and turning it over and looking at what was there. She thought about the morning room at 7 o'clock and the brass lamp with its extra reservoirs, and the music room and the folded composition on the cabinet, and the way he had taken her hand at the table yesterday and held it there while the room watched and required no one's permission. She thought about the cold frames that needed replacing, and the kitchen garden's neglect, and the fact that she had been in houses where she was useful and not seen, and in this house, for the first time, she had been both. "Yes," she said, "I will." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand again, the same hand, the bare right one, and held it, and they stood by the stone wall in the Shropshire morning with the oaks above them, and she thought that this was, in its way, exactly like the documents she read, not the representation of what someone said it contained, but what was actually there when you looked carefully. They were married in October, at the parish church in the village below the park, with Keene and his wife in the second pew, and Nora in a good bonnet, and Mrs. Fenn providing the flowers from the kitchen garden, which Prudence had spent the summer restoring. Lady Meredith attended and did not say anything that was openly objectionable, which Prudence understood as the version of approval available to them under the circumstances, and received accordingly. Lady Cecily Wyndham Rowe had left Ashworth Park the week after the investor meeting, with her mother and all the luggage, and had gone to her family's estate in Herefordshire. She was engaged by Christmas to a baronet from Worcestershire, whom everyone agreed was well suited to her, and Prudence had no reason to think otherwise. The Manchester investor, whose name was Mr. Samuel Bright, wrote to Rees in November, with a proposal for a legitimate commercial arrangement with the Ashworth estate, organized along the lines Prudence's documentation had made clear were defensible. The letter was addressed to the Duke of Ashworth, but included a postscript that said, "In the dry manner of a man who finds precision more comfortable than sentiment, Miss Hollis's organizational framework for estate agreements is the clearest I have encountered. I have recommended it to my own solicitors as a model." She was now Prudence Ashworth, and Rees read her the postscript at the breakfast table and watched her face, and she said, "He had better cite the source," and he said, without expression, "I will ensure he does," and she knew from his face that he was going to do exactly that. Gerald Vane settled his legal liability the following spring, under an arrangement negotiated by Keene that recovered £3,200 for the estate, and kept the matter from open court. Vane left Shropshire. Prudence did not think about him often, except occasionally when she was organizing the estate agreements, which she had now reformed entirely, with a clear authorization threshold system that required no notation, no separate attachment, no ambiguity. Their son was born in the second year of their marriage. They named him William, after Prudence's father, with Rees's middle name, Edmund, as his second, which was the kind of compromise they were both good at, the kind that serves the actual question rather than the preference of either party. He was a deliberate child who looked at everything with large dark eyes and had, from his earliest weeks, the particular quality of paying attention to whatever was in the room. Rees said he got it from her. She said he got it from his father. They were both right. The kitchen garden was fully productive by the second summer. The cold frames had been replaced. The beds had been restored and expanded, and Prudence had organized a small system of crop rotation with the kitchen's requirements that Mrs. Fenn, who had stayed as housekeeper and had settled into the household's new arrangement with the equanimity of a woman who has been quietly relieved of a long burden, implemented with gratifying thoroughness. The estate agreement framework Prudence had built was written up formally and sent, at Keene's request, to 3 neighboring estates who were in various stages of management reorganization. She wrote it as a practical document rather than a scholarly one. Clear column headers, authorization thresholds organized by category, attached index. 2 of the 3 estates adopted it wholesale. The third modified it, which she considered reasonable, because the document had not been written for estates exactly like theirs. In the 3rd year of their marriage, on an autumn afternoon when the oaks at the edge of the kitchen garden had gone amber, Prudence was in the morning room with the quarterly accounts when William escaped his nurse and came clattering down the corridor and into the room, and climbed, with impressive determination, onto the chair beside hers and attempted to reach the inkwell. She intercepted the inkwell with her left hand without looking up from the accounts, and held him in the chair with the practiced ease of someone who has been managing small crises before breakfast since she was old enough to be given one, and went on reading the account figures. Rees was standing in the doorway. She had not heard him come. He had come quietly, as he did most things. He had a habit of finding her, and not immediately announcing himself, as though the finding were enough, and the rest could wait. She looked up and saw him there. He was in his working coat, which he had taken to wearing in the mornings since they had established the new management regime together, and he was looking at her with the measuring attention he had first shown her in the linen corridor 2.5 years ago, except that it was not measuring anything anymore. It was simply the look of a man who has confirmed, repeatedly, what he already knew. She held the inkwell away from William's reaching hand. She looked at Reese across the morning room. The accounts show a recovered margin of £400 on the Eastern Tenant Farms since last year's revision, she said. I believe you will be pleased. I believe I already am, he said, and came in.